vocabulary and grammar of modernity and modernization. There were competing ideas and agendas. And as the book editors and authors of the book are quite eager to remind us, the Unity Socialist vision was one of the many tiles that was not taken in Singapore history, to refer to a recent book that was also published. In a way, the narrative also comments on this Chinese educated versus English educated dichotomy that usually appears in some representations of student activism, most famously in Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs. And in fact, the book kind of reinforces this sense of cultural divide when Goh Keng Yew notes himself in his chapter on how the Chinese educated were different from English educated in terms of lifestyle, ideology, as well as intellectual influences. This ultimately entails that it is both impossible to paint as well as taint the student activists in Singapore with one broad brush. However, this book also suggests that the two worlds should not be seen as wholly dichotomous, but as overlapping and converging on some points and issues. For example, their common identity as students and belief in student rights. This convergence gave the students some basis and impetus to cut across linguistic and cultural lines in order to form joint student action movements, as well as to rise to assist one another on separate occasions. In being a collection of recollections and analytical essays that do not really revolve around a central analytical theme or direction, this book also offers us a glimpse into the social political milieux of these student activists, which is more complicated than the current narratives allow, as well as more complex than the narrative focused on the USC allows. Right. Hence, while the Fragile Generation is an important introduction, it reveals only one slice of the landscape of student activism in the university from the Unity Socialist point of view. Within this account, we see glimpses of many other different aspects of student life and activism in the University of Malaya and the University of Singapore during this period. For example, cross-institutional and transnational student connections, participation in international student conferences, and concern about international crises and events, which is ironic because it shows that back then we had a very globalized student body, and now we are asking them to be globalized citizens. Right? This book also mentions other student concerns outside of national level political developments, for example, university autonomy and academic freedom, as well as the attempts to form a national union of students, a notion that today students don't really entertain. Simply put, there is much more to uncover about the history of student activism in Singapore, as well as the stories of the other groups of student activists within the university. For example, the Democratic Socialist Club that was formed in 1963 and still exists today. As the book editors themselves write, student politics in colonial Malaya and Singapore consisted of various diverse strands, each with its own history, its traditions, and sets of problems. This is true within the same institution itself. Other than the Socialist Club, there were other activists who took on different positions and issues. For example, other councillors in the Students' Union, the political clubs that were formed to rival the Socialist Club at different points in time, like the Democratic Club in the 1950s and the Democratic Socialist Club in the 1960s, and individual student leaders. In fact, actually, we also have a first-generation member of the DSC, the Democratic Socialist Club, in the audience, Professor Kotai An, so maybe she would like to share about her point of view of the story, right, later. For those who do not know, Professor had earlier given her account of her days as a student leader in an earlier interview with the Tangent Group. Right. So you can check that out as well. There was disagreement between the socialists and other students on various issues, for example, merger, the meaning and application of socialism. Some disagreed with the socialists over the boundaries of student activism. What did being a student activist mean? What could student activists do? Should student activism be limited to campus and student issues? And whether students were to play a role in national politics. During this period, even the identity and purpose of a university student was in a state of fluidity and contestation. Unlike today, when I was growing up, my mom told me to go to school, get a good career. That's what there is to it. There were other students who were very unhappy with the socialist club's often aggressive approach, as well as there was a bit of a self-righteous tone in their interactions with the other students. As you can tell from the pieces in the book, the University Socialists were a very extremely passionate and committed lot. However, passion seen from another angle, especially when it's coloured by the lenses of the ongoing Cold War, could be easily read as an ideological bewitchment, as one critic of the USC accused them of in the 1960s. This diversive and divided dynamics perhaps explain why the nature and strength of student activism in this university seldom match the shape and intensity of that in the Chinese medium institutions. Only when the various groups of student activists on campus converge on certain issues did significant movements arise in the university. Therefore, if you reinstate only the narrative of the university socialists themselves, it could compel us to overestimate the place as well as the success of the socialist club within the context of student activism in the institution, and be unable to understand how student activism developed the way it did in that institution. In terms of sheer numbers, for example, there were other significant movements like the university autonomy movements of the 1960s, as well as the Tan Wah Piao and the Juliet Chin-led student movement in the 1970s, which is particularly interesting because it was not only a significant milestone in the course of student politics in Singapore due to its strength, but also a movement that will reflect the social and cultural transformations that Singapore went through in the decade after independence as we modernized and grew economically, and also reflect the continuation of paths not taken after the 1960s. Okay, I will now proceed to show some pictures to show actually how there is much more to restore to public knowledge with regards to this topic of student activism. So this is a cartoon from Psych, which was actually created by one of the socialists, Raja Rao, showing the death of Fajar. I don't know what he's trying to do. Right. This is an image from a Malay undergrad showing the students having an emergency general meeting to protest the Enright affair, where a British professor, DJ Enright, was criticized and threatened by the PAP government for speaking out on the cultural topics. This is on the University Autonomy Day of 1966. From the Enright affair to 1966, there was a view of tensions over this issue of university autonomy and academic freedom, which eventually culminated in within this university autonomy movement. So we have all these signs bashing a certain political leader. Students from Raffles Hall getting ready to march, their actual march. They tried to march out from the BTC campus to Orchard, to Bukit Timah Road, but they were stopped. The rallies. This was 1974, the trial of USU President Tan Wah Piao, who actually led the students on the socio-economic kind of movement to help, for example, help people protest the bus fare hike, help workers, retrenched workers especially. So he was arrested for alleged rioting in the premises of the PIUD, the Pioneer Industries Employees Union, and this was where the students actually gathered outside the court to try to rally for his cause. These are the rallies for the arrest of the Tan Wah Piao and other students leaders during 1974. And this was the other rallies against the University of Singapore Amendment Act in 1975. Originally, the University of Malaya Student Union was constitutionally autonomous, except that this act, ironically introduced by a former University Socialist Club member, Chua Shin Chin, took away the autonomy of the Students' Union. And this was the student leaders trying to rally against this particular legislation. Now I will go on to discuss some challenges of writing other Singapore stories. When I first sat down and thought about this, however, I begin to feel that I'm not really qualified or well-read enough to talk about this topic. So I've chosen to approach this topic self-reflexively, right, and base my views on my own personal experience. And I titled this last section of my discussion, "The Confessions of a Lousy Graduate Student." My intention is to share some of the mistakes that I made and some of the struggles that I faced as well in the process of doing my research on student activism in Singapore. Ironically, the first mistake I made was to be too overly fixated on seeing student activists as a marginalized group. I mean, when I was started out as a graduate student, I was like one of the young Singaporeans that Dr. Loh mentioned, very eager to uncover other Singapore stories, to want to find stories that will present counter-narratives to the state's narratives. With this, my initial agenda at point of departure, I set out to find like activities like